Alrighty, so we're just going to go ahead and get started. So we're going to be talking today about the idea of process versus outcome. This is the meta principle underlying our decisions, values, character, identity, and the self. So also we just want to extend some gratitude towards Dr. Brown, who actually was instrumental in informing a lot of the ideas behind this talk. So disclaimer is that these views are purely my own. Here's an outline. So we're going to be talking about some objectives of the talk, introduction, and then we're going to get in the first half of our session, be talking about how this idea applies to society, organizations, teams, on that kind of macro level. Then the second half of the talk will be talking more about how this applies on an interpersonal level and an intrapersonal level. So how this applies in terms of your own personal experience. So objectives are to understand the meta principle of process versus outcome, and then to be able to appreciate its relevance on societal, organizational, interpersonal, and intrapersonal levels, and then to apply this meta principle to personally relevant domains of personal and professional life. So for our introduction, and so when you hear process versus outcome, probably for many of you, the first thing that comes to mind is process versus content. Is that the same thing, or is there a difference in that? So there's a difference, and process versus content is one very important example of the broader principle of process versus outcome. And so just to kind of review the idea of process versus content, content is what someone says or does. And these are things that are typically objectively verifiable. You and I can both agree on the content of any given situation. Versus the process is the how or why behind the content. In other words, it can also be the message behind the content or what's happening in the interpersonal dynamic. And so, for example, if I were to give you or a patient a box of tissue, that would be the content. Versus the process, from my perspective, perhaps being, I care about you. I want you to feel better, or that kind of thing. Versus from their perspective, the process might be, oh, you're uncomfortable with how I feel, or how I feel, or I shouldn't feel sad, or perhaps they're invalidated. And so there's an infinite number of ways in how the process can play out. And one other important example of process would be the here and now, as Yalom describes it. And so ultimately, this is essentially appropriate therapeutic self-disclosure. So this isn't the kind of self-disclosure of, hey, this is where I hang out on weekends, or here's some personal information about me, but rather self-disclosure that is therapeutic in a way that makes the process explicit. And so an example, at least for me, that comes to mind in my own personal practice is a situation where there's a patient, older patient, who frankly kind of dominating these sessions, and got to a point where I made a here and now statement of, or process statement of, I noticed myself feeling frustrated and somewhat devalued, and I wonder to what extent this also plays out within your relationship with your husband and your son. And I only said that because I knew from our past experience that was playing out. And by making that process explicit, for one, it's hard to do because it requires vulnerability and courage to be able to actually say something like that. That's inherently uncomfortable. But on the flip side, at least for me, some of the most impactful moments in therapy have been those here and now situations, those moments of true vulnerability. And in that specific situation I discussed, that really did open up a whole new door of therapy that really otherwise wouldn't have been opened without that line of discussion. And so again, process, if you really think about it, actually it can be subjective and is influenced by your beliefs, interpretation, expectations, transference, and countertransference. And so just another example of a content that's spoken might be advice giving. And so if I'm perhaps giving you advice and I have in the process, I have the best intentions, and maybe I care about you. First, from your perspective, maybe your interpretation is that you think I'm stupid. And so perhaps from your perspective, perhaps you think I'm stupid because I can't figure out this advice myself. Another example, and we already talked about an unspoken example of content being the tissue paradox. of, do I give the tissues or not, and how that plays out. Another interesting thing in terms of process is the idea of metaphor. And so if you really think about it, metaphor is actually a vehicle to send process messages or to speak in the process, where the content of the metaphor really doesn't matter. And really, you're just trying to convey a message in the process of that metaphor. So if you have a classic active duty soldier who perhaps is ambivalent about coming to therapy, get to a point of bringing up a metaphor, weapons maintenance, that coming to therapy is kind of like weapons maintenance, and kind of just taking that metaphor and expanding on that in whatever way makes sense to that particular patient. Another familiar example of process versus outcome is the classic metaphor of life is a journey, not a destination. So by now, I imagine we've all heard of this metaphor, and really this is just another hopefully familiar way of exemplifying the idea of process versus outcome, where the journey is a process, the destination is outcome. And so in this metaphor, the idea is really prioritizing and focusing on the process and kind of deprioritizing or defocusing on the outcome. So as we go along through this whole discussion, just wanted to point out that there's no one example. We're going to go through a lot of different examples of process versus outcome, but no one example is going to be able to fully capture this idea of process versus outcome. So here I have a picture of little Rose Wolfgang, super cute. Maybe I'm biased. And we have several different perspectives of Rose. And if each example that we're going to be talking about today is one specific and different perspective of the concept of process versus outcome, then process versus outcome is the idea of perspective, if that makes sense. So again, we're going to be talking about a lot of different examples, and each of these examples is just an example of the broader idea of process versus outcome. So we already talked about these two examples being examples of process versus outcome. We're going to be talking about infinite versus the finite, and touch on that briefly, values, and many more examples. So infinite versus finite games. So there's two main books on this topic, one of which more recently written by Simon Sinek. And in the original book by James Carse several decades ago, he says there are at least two kinds of games. One can be called finite, the other infinite. A finite game is played for the purpose of winning, an infinite game for the purpose of continuing play. So finite games are games with known players, fixed rules, and agreed upon objective. So a clear example of that would be a sports game, a physical quarter, an academic quarter, or a patient outcome. Infinite games have known and unknown players, changeable rules, and the objective is to perpetuate the game or to stay in the game as long as possible. So examples of that, so instead of a sports game being the infinite game of athletics. So no one has ever won the game of athletics. Instead of physical quarter, the game of business. No one has ever won the game of business. And instead of academic quarter, the game of education. Instead of patient outcome, the game of medicine. So these are, no one has ever won these infinite games. And the point of the game isn't necessarily to win, but is to perpetuate the game and to keep the game going, because the game in itself has immense value and importance. So differentiating finite versus infinite to process versus outcome. And so outcomes are definitive, they're objective, they're binary. You can say yes or no, the outcome happened or not. And these are externally verifiable. You and I, in any given situation, can agree on what the outcome was or is. And so examples perhaps are grades, scores, goals, wants, needs. Core needs, and we're definitely going to get into this a bit more later. Expectations, assumptions, hopes, should, have to, supposed to. And so we're actually going to touch on each of these, or most of these, throughout the talk, but this is more to kind of just prime you as we go along. And so examples of process, or features of the process, are that the process is perpetual, it's indefinite, it's on a spectrum. And typically process is only internally verifiable, but there might be external signals. So for example, if I'm being honest, and honesty being the process, there might be external signals, and you might pick up that I'm being honest in this situation, but only I can internally verify that. That's just another feature of processes. And so another perspective is that processes are the how or the why. They're typically means towards an outcome. And broader examples of that being values, culture. With culture, even culture can only be internally verifiable within the system. So even though you might get external signals of that, it's really, you have to be in the culture to be able to verify it. Mindset, approach, preparation, planning, reasoning, decision-making, and perspective. And we're going to go certainly more into most of these throughout the talk. So this is a broad outline of the entire talk. So we're talking about society, organization, teams, interpersonal, intrapersonal. So on this level, and again, this is kind of an outline of this section. So Simon Sinek talks about this example of having gone to a summit at Microsoft where 80% of the presentations were how to beat Apple. Then went to a summit at Apple where 100% of the presentations were how to help teachers teach, help kids learn, and contribute to the community. And so at one point, he was sitting in the back of a car with one of the Apple executives. He was telling him, like, hey, dude, well, he probably didn't say dude, but in my version of the story, he does. Hey, dude, like Zoom is so much better than your iPod, and blah, blah, blah. And the Apple exec turns to him and says, I have no doubt. I think that really captures the essence of Apple's approach. And so Microsoft was focused on beating Apple, whereas Apple was focused on their values independent of the competition. And perhaps the competition did inform their decisions, but it wasn't about the competition. So when you think of basketball greats, especially in the modern era from the 1990s or so, who comes to mind as someone that won probably the most rings since the 1990s? And if you're thinking Michael Jordan, you're probably right, because he had 6 rings. And if you think of another player in the modern era that won many championships, who else might come to mind? And
Robert Horry.
Robert Horry? Okay.
Kobe,
yeah, exactly.
R.I.P.
Yeah, exactly. Seriously, rest in peace. Yeah, Kobe, 5 rings. And so when you think of these two players, what coach comes to mind that actually ties these two players together? Who's the common denominator between these two players in terms of their coach?
Phil Jackson.
Exactly. There you go, Rumble. So Phil Jackson, absolutely. And so Phil Jackson coached for 20 years in the NBA. Out of those 20 years, he won the NBA championship. His team won the NBA championship 11 times. 11 out of 20 years, his team won the championship. Just for some perspective, there's 30 teams in the NBA, and only 2 of them ever get to the finals in any given year. And only, obviously, one of them, 1 out of 30, wins a championship. This guy and his teams won 11 out of 20 championships. So if you're more interested in kind of delving more into his story and his perspectives, certainly check out his book. But from his book, this is probably one of the most, in my opinion, important passages that really give you a good picture of the way that he thinks and his process. Being fixated on winning, or more likely not losing, is counterproductive, especially when it causes you to lose control of your emotions. What's more, obsessing about winning is a loser's game. The most we can hope for is to create the best possible conditions for success, then let go of the outcome. And so here is one of the most winningest coaches in all of NBA history saying that winning isn't the point. How does that even make sense? What matters most is playing the game the right way and having the courage to grow as human beings as well as basketball players. And note that human beings is before basketball players. When you do that, the ring takes care of itself. So interpretation, prioritizing the outcome often unintentionally pushes it away. Outcomes matter. Obviously, winning does matter. But what matters more is the process. When you prioritize the process, the outcome takes care of itself. And lastly, instead of focusing on the desired outcome, Focus should be on prioritizing the process in order to optimize the probability of the desired outcome. There's no way to guarantee the outcome, but all you can do is give yourself the best possible chances of success. And that only happens when you prioritize and focus on the process. And so another actual disciple and player that played under Phil Jackson, he went on to be a coach of the Warriors the past 5 years. So in his first 5 seasons as head coach of the Warriors, and as head coach at all, won nearly 80% of his games. Actually ended up having the winningest season in all of NBA history, even more than Phil Jackson. In his first 5 seasons, every single time his team, when the Warriors got to the NBA Finals, 3 of which he won the NBA championship. And so think to yourself, what's he about? What are his priorities? Is it to crush the opponent, or is it, and spoiler alert, it is joy, compassion, mindfulness, perspective, competition. These are his explicitly stated priorities. These are all processes. These aren't outcomes. Compare that to Bill Belichick. And I can already sense Dr. Koval bristling about this. So, by the way, Bill Belichick's the head coach of New England Patriots, and he has these brilliant quotes. "We feel what's important to us is to win. We're just trying to go out there and win a game. Winning is the goal." And so, by the way, it actually worked out for him. So he actually has 8 rings, 2 as an assistant coach and 6 with the Patriots as a head coach. And so the point being, focusing and prioritizing the outcome doesn't necessarily push it away, but it can have unintended consequences. And we saw this several times for the past few years. So Spygate, where he was actually, long story short, fined $500,000 for spying their team. And a lot of other consequences of that. Deflategate, maybe another Spygate situation just this current season. And are these potentially a product, unintended or maybe intended consequences of being outcome oriented to win? This also plays out in healthcare. In healthcare, there are actually actual things called process measures and outcome measures. And there's actually some that are pretty familiar to us already. So outcome measures, for example, being really anything you see on BHDP, PHQ-9 and PCL scores, versus process measures, which for anyone in our multi-D clinic is also familiar with. And one process measure being ensuring that the patient has 3 sessions within the first 3 months. And so, obviously we don't really care about the patient coming in for 3 sessions to 3 months, but in a way we actually really care about that, because we understand in the literature that when patients have the best chance of getting better, when they actually come to appointments. And there's a certain frequency of appointments that give patients the best chance of actually staying in treatment. And so when we focus on process measures, how does that actually improve our outcome measures? We also see outcome versus process measures in the COVID pandemic. And so outcome measure, for example, being the date to lift social distancing policies in your region, your state, or in your country. Process measures being, for example, the capacity for effective testing, screening, and contact tracing, availability of PPE and critical medical equipment, ability to surge ICU capacity. And so what happens when the focus is on the outcome and the problems we run into that, versus what happens when our focus and the priorities turn to these process measures that then actually have a positive impact on the outcome that we really care about. Another example of how this plays out in healthcare. So there's a situation in 2014, here you see the VA's motto, "To care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan." So what happened in 2014, the VA came out with an idea of incentivizing VA hospitals to make sure that, and to measure how many veterans were getting appointments within 14 days. And then depending on that outcome measure, that would actually affect their hospital's reimbursements. Hospitals were incentivized to maximize this outcome measure. What happened ultimately were that over 100,000 veterans are put on these secret wait lists. The most egregious situation being the Phoenix VA, where 35 veterans died while on the secret wait list. And there's an example of Thomas Breen, where in September he came in with bloody urine, history of cancer, initially told, "Hey, we'll see you in 1 week." Ended up being placed on the secret waiting list. And in November, he died of bladder cancer. And then in December, only then after he had passed did he get the call to make an appointment. What if the money and the resources that were used to incentivize the outcome measure, were instead used to promote process measures, perhaps increasing, for example, increasing compensation for VA physicians in order to recruit more physicians to then hopefully reduce wait times. And you can think of an infinite number of possible process measures. But what if the focus was on those instead of this outcome, which really incentivized, in one respect, these secret wait lists and actually pushing away the outcome and having unintended consequences? So another example of process versus outcome on an organizational level can actually turn to the Navy SEALs. Navy SEALs, this has come from Simon Sinek's book. So he found that there's two main factors that they look for in their fellow SEALs. One being performance. So, it's a function of your technical competence, grit, calm under pressure. Performance ultimately is an outcome. You can measure that performance. Versus trust, which is a process. That's a function of humility, personal accountability, respect, psychological safety, your character, values, integrity. And interestingly, one of the SEALs actually said this, which interestingly also happens to be an example from the trust module in cognitive processing therapy, where they say, I may trust you with my life, but do I trust you with my money or my wife? I think we can all agree that low performance, low trust, that no one wants that person. I mean, typically you don't really want that person in your team, whether it's the Navy SEALs or a residency program. Versus the high performance, high trust individual, we all want that person on our team. But when it comes to the high performance, low trust guy versus the medium or low performance, high trust individual, and think to yourself, who would we want more? Who would you want more on your team? So, oops, sorry about that. Actually just came as a fake out. So what they find, even in Navy SEALs, they would rather have the medium or even low performance guy who they can trust rather than the high performance, low trust guy. But they found that the high performance, low trust guy is a toxic team member in a lot of different ways. And so, and keep in mind, a low performer in the SEALs is still a relatively high performer. So a specific example of this, Eddie Gallagher, SEAL Team 7. So because this is a highly politically charged topic, I'm only going to state the facts that are publicly available and not editorialize on this topic. So the facts: he was court-martialed. Gallagher was Navy SEAL. He's court-martialed, accused of the murder of a POW, a prisoner of war, wrongfully posing for an unofficial picture with a human casualty and several other charges, which you see there. That was the actual picture. And he was acquitted of all the charges except he was found guilty of posing with the picture. He was not demoted, and he kept his trident. And there's a lot of politics that went into that. That really is outside the scope of this talk. So what's the motto? Kind of think to yourself, what are the components of a motto? What is that? Merriam-Webster would say a motto is a short sentence or phrase chosen as encapsulating the beliefs or ideals guiding an individual, family, or institution. And so this is this is from 60 Minutes. You can watch it yourself. And so this is the actual plaque from their deployment as a memorabilia of the deployment. And on the bottom of the plaque is their motto, which we're going to get to. Kind of think to yourself, what might be the motto of their deployment? These are Navy SEALs, high-performing guys with an intense sense of purpose and meaning behind their job, what they do. Kind of think to yourself, what might be their motto? Something about spreading democracy or defending, freedom, that kind of, who knows? We actually do know that was their motto. And again, not to editorialize, but objectively, this is an outcome. To be perfectly honest, a rather visionary outcome. It's not an outcome that is reasonable, but it's a visionary outcome. I'm not going to get into this, but the commander of Naval Special Warfare Command came out with a publicly available memo saying that the Navy has strayed from its core values and that we've eroded the foundation of trust. Was this situation the result of individual ethical failure? Was it a result of failure of leadership, the environment, and the system around him? Or was it a mixture of both? Where do you stand? And this is a hypothetical question or a rhetorical question, and just kind of consider that to yourself. So there's another great book by James Clear, Atomic Habits. And if you don't get a chance to read it, this statement practically sums up the entire book. So you do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. And you can easily substitute this by saying, you do not rise to the level of your outcomes. You fall to the level of your processes. And how did that play out for an Eddie Gallagher situation? What was the system around him? Well, how did that play out for Phil Jackson and his teams? How did that play out for Bill Belichick? So in conclusion, at least for this section, prioritizing the outcome more likely leads to unintended consequences. But when you prioritize the process, the outcome takes care of itself. So this next section, we're going to be talking more about interpersonal and intrapersonal domains of process versus outcome. So in terms of decision making, so here we have Aristotle on the left, Elon Musk on the right, and perhaps fielding a coronavirus haircut. So they both actually talk about this idea of first principles versus analogy in terms of decision making. Reasoning by analogy, that's what you're supposed to do, how things are supposed to be, how it's always been done, iterating on an established theme. So for example, Zune iterating on the iPod, based on assumptions and conventions. And ultimately, this is outcome-oriented thinking versus reasoning by first principles, and first principles being the fundamental principles and truths that can't be deduced any further. So for example, pi, 3.14 whatever, that's an established truth. You can't argue that pi equals 5. So these are first principles. And so by reasoning through first principles, instead of jumping to just what to do, you add in kind of a half step of first identifying and agreeing upon what are the fundamental principles that we're all working with. And then instead of debating what to do, you debate how to prioritize those fundamental principles. And then once we agree on how to, and what our first principles are, and once we've prioritized them and agree on that priority, typically what to do from there and the outcome or the decision actually becomes self-evident and is actually often a more confident decision. And this is an example of process-oriented thinking. So if you've ever been in a situation, and I imagine we've all encountered situations like this where I want to do one thing and you want to do something different, or you have another idea. So what's happening typically in those kind of situations is that we're both arguing over the outcome, and perhaps from our perspectives, the outcome that we come to is the best way to do it on how we have prioritized our fundamental principles. But what's happening is that the way that we're prioritizing our principles is different. And that's why we're coming to different decisions on how to do the thing. So these situations where I think we should do this, you think we should do something else. The goal, hopefully, to come to true confident consensus is to not argue about what we should do, but rather what are the principles that we're working with? And can we agree on those principles? And can we agree on how to prioritize those principles? Another example, Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winning economist, also wrote this book that hopefully we're familiar with, at least the principles that we're familiar with. And so he talks about system one, which is a type of thinking that's quick, it's unconscious, it's automatic. And he also describes system two kind of thinking that's slow, it's conscious, it's more deliberate. And so it's hopefully self-evident that system one is just another example of thinking by analogy versus system two being thinking from first principles. And so Jocko Willink, another one of my personally favorite authors, and I encourage you to check out his books if you're interested. He says, when you don't know what to do, just do something. Oprah is famous for saying, when you don't know what to do nothing. So who's right? And perhaps are they both right? When things are time sensitive, you're in combat, you do need to think by analogy, or system one thinking, having outcome oriented thinking, where relying on your training and how you've always done things, versus when things are not time sensitive. Perhaps it's better to think from first principles, system two kind of thinking, process oriented kind of thinking. Problems arise when you perceive it being a time sensitive situation, yet you're wasting too much time by thinking from first principles, or you're perceiving it as a not time sensitive situation and you're thinking by analogy. So like code blue, when it's time sensitive, your training just needs to kick in. You just need to do the thing and how you've been trained to do it. You know, there's infinite kind of iterations on how that goes. And so kind of applying this appropriate way of decision making in the appropriate kind of situation. So perhaps now you come to a point where you found the best possible decision and you start adding more and more great explanation as to why it's the best decision. Is this process or outcome oriented thinking? So I really think we should do this thing. And these are all the reasons why I really think we should do the thing. So this is still actually outcome oriented thinking. And this is an example of what is called motivated reasoning, where we actually started with the outcome. We start piling on reasons as to why that's the best outcome. And so this is one of the situations that can actually unintentionally masquerade as reasoning with first principles, because you have all these great reasons, but really what's happening is that you're still focusing on the outcome. So if you're more interested in this kind of stuff and decision making, I'd highly encourage you to check out Annie Duke's book, Thinking in Bets. So Annie Duke was a professional poker player, won I think like $4 million playing poker, and now wrote this book really great. In that same book, she talks about this situation. This is Super Bowl. For those who don't know, this is Super Bowl 49, Seattle Seahawks versus New England Patriots. These are the last seconds of the game. Seattle is down by 4. If they score a touchdown here, they're most likely going to win the game. They're at the 1 yard line, as you can see. So for anyone that can remember, so what happens next? What happened on this play?
So this is Dr. Jones. So they should have given it to Marshawn Lynch, but instead they passed it and it got intercepted and they lost.
Exactly. And I just want to hone in on a super important thing that you just said. They should have handed it to Marshawn Lynch. And that
I stand by that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No. And that's the consensus. And so most people agree with you. So this is the seconds later where they got intercepted and New England won the game. Sports Illustrated called it the worst play call in NFL history. ESPN, Pete Carroll, the coach of the Seahawks, botches the Super Bowl. The worst call in Super Bowl history. The worst, even NPR got in on it, of all people. The worst call in Super Bowl history. Was it the worst call in Super Bowl history based on the outcome, or was it the worst call in Super Bowl history based on the decision making behind the outcome? If you take the time to look into the statistics and the decision making behind what happened, that entire season, out of 66 similar situations where there was a pass on the 1 yard line, 0 were intercepted. In the past 15 years before that, only 2% of the time was a pass on the 1 yard line intercepted, only 2% of the time. And when you really get into it, you realize that if they passed the ball and it was incomplete, they actually would have been able to get in 3 plays. Whereas if they ran the ball, it'd be more like that they would only be able to get in 2 last plays. And so based on that, we can start talking about the idea of resulting. And so resulting is the idea that determining the quality of a decision is based on the quality of the outcome. It's because the outcome was admittedly really bad in this situation, really devastating. That means the decision was bad. Versus determining the quality of a decision based on not the quality of the outcome, but on the quality of the decision-making process. You can also hear talk about resulting's close cousin, hindsight bias. And so hindsight bias is the tendency after an outcome is known. In this case, it was intercepted and they lost the game, lost the Super Bowl. The tendency after an outcome is known to see the outcome as having been inevitable and the problems that arise from that. And so you can pick this out when you hear someone saying, I should have done this, or you should have done that. And just like, and thank you again, Dr. Jones, for contributing. I just want to notice that you said he should have. And this is at the core of guilt and blame and self-blame. And we see this clinically all the time. And so I just want to, at this point, give credit to Dr. Tremaine, who has done a really great job in terms of, frankly, educating us incredibly well on how to clinically work through guilt through hindsight bias. And we're not going to, I think that the technique and the maneuvers behind that really are outside of the scope of this talk, but just want to give credit to Dr. Tremaine, because through understanding hindsight bias and how to apply that clinically, frankly, you can have pretty remarkable outcomes in just a single session in situations of uncomplicated guilt, and really resolve for the most part in a single session by really applying the principles of hindsight bias. Just one metaphor that hits the point home, hopefully, is the idea of the lottery ticket. And so hindsight bias with lottery tickets being, once you know the winning numbers after the fact, is it really rational to say that I should have picked those numbers? Of course not. Another clinical pearl from cognitive processing therapy is kind of looking out for the should haves. And when you process through the grief, through techniques of hindsight, of applying hindsight bias, you'll spontaneously eventually hear the patient or the person, instead of saying I should have, instead of saying I wish this other thing happened. And that is when you know that we've transitioned from processing guilt to now your job is to help process the grief. And so another kind of way of getting at it is, in what ways does it actually make sense that you did the thing that you did? And kind of allowing the patient to elaborate on that. And again, there's a lot of different techniques to get to the same outcome. After really applying hindsight bias and guilt, you really start to uncover a fundamental principle, a first principle, fundamental truth, a core belief that we are always making the best possible decision for ourselves with the limited resources, information, and perspective available to us at the time. That, in my view, is a fundamental truth, just like pi. And it's hard to argue with that once you start really seeing it. And once that becomes your fundamental truth, and once that starts to inform your worldview, the world really does become a more compassionate place. And not literally, but just from your perspective. So what did Pete Carroll have to say about this decision? So this is an interview of Matt Lauer the day after the Super Bowl. And he was asked about the worst decision in football history. What Pete Carroll had to say was that, well, it was actually the worst result of a call ever. Not the worst call ever, but the worst result of a call ever. He understood the idea of resulting, maybe not consciously, but he understood the concept of resulting and hindsight bias. Clinical applications. And so this, in my view, is incredibly important, and frankly has transformed the way that I practice psychiatry and practice psychotherapy in a way that has helped me really be more helpful to my patients. And hopefully by sharing this with you, hopefully you can start applying perhaps these principles in a way so that you can be more helpful to your patients. So secondary outcomes being things that are conscious, external, things that you do. Primary outcomes being essentially unconscious, and these are our core needs. And processes essentially being our values and are only internally verifiable. So for example, a secondary outcome being just meeting any basic physiological need. This can, for example, be addictive behaviors or just eating, for example. Primary outcome, the core need being comfort, relief. Process being to care either for ourselves or others. And just to reiterate, the primary outcome, the core need, can be artificially met by secondary outcomes, these external things. And the goal or the hope of therapy is to be able to meet that core need through the process instead. And by the way, so this slide, you are probably already doing this, but the hope here is to make it more explicit so that you can actually apply what you're doing with more intentionality. So another secondary outcome being just any behavior that mitigates physical or emotional pain or discomfort. You can think of infinite examples of what people do to mitigate physical or emotional pain. Primary outcome, core need being psychological safety, physical safety. Process being trust, either trusting yourself, trusting in others. And when you trust in yourself, that promotes self-efficacy and adaptability. Another secondary outcome being behaviors that elicit attention or affection from others. Again, infinite examples of what that might look like. For example, I really want, this person to like me, for example. Core need being to be accepted, to be emotionally connected. Process being acceptance of yourself or others, and connection. Another secondary outcome being behavior, any behavior that distinguishes you with conspicuous social value. And so, an example of that being perhaps how much money you have and what car you drive, perhaps how smart you are, perhaps, or your physical looks can potentially confer you having superior social value. And so the primary outcome ultimately is to be respected. And the process being to be able to respect yourself, to respect others in certain situations, integrity, sacrifice. And how does that feed into being respected by yourself? And finally, there's a point where outcomes, instead of being the priority, they're simply guides in a direction. And where values are prioritized, and there's congruence in values and character and your identity and behavior. And so there's a lot going on here, a lot of different outcomes, a lot of different processes. Is there a way to organize this in a way that makes sense and that's structured? Fortunately, Maslow has already done that for us. And so I don't know about you, but for me, Maslow really never paid too much attention to what he had to say, except for kind of the general idea that, oh, there is a hierarchy of needs. But if you get into it, he really understood that there's different levels of motivation, and practically all motivation can be tied back into these 5 core needs, and these 5 core motivations. And each of these motivations can actually be subdivided, which is outside the scope of this talk. But at the end of the day, practically all motivation can be tied into these 5 core needs. And just as an extra layer of perspective, and again, just another thing that really was, at least for me, a breakthrough in how I approach psychotherapy, is that all emotions can be tied back to an outcome. Every single possible emotional experience that anyone ever has, to include yourself, is tied into an outcome. And there's a whole, I think great discussion to have there, which really is outside the scope of this talk. But start looking for that if you haven't already. All emotions are tied to outcomes. So all this talk about values, so is that just kind of me making that up, or is this something that's established? And so there's actually, as far as I know, there's at least 2 modalities of psychotherapy that actually prioritize values as important. Acceptance commitment therapy is actually one of the 6 core domains of acceptance commitment therapy. Motivational interviewing, there's an entire chapter on simply values and how that guides our behaviors. So in the interest of time, I'm kind of just going to glance over this, but the idea, so just kind of think to yourself, if you were to find a wallet on the ground, no one else is looking, no one's there, no one would ever know, what would you do? Kind of think to yourself, what would you do? And why would you do that? Ultimately, values guide our behaviors, and our behaviors create evidence to ourselves, which reinforce our character. And when we identify with that and consciously identify with that, that forms our identity versus secondary outcomes. So I'm only going to do this if I get credit for this from someone else. I'm only going to be honest if someone else is going to give me credit. That also informs our behaviors. That creates evidence to others, which also reinforces our identity. But the only difference here being our character can only be derived from creating evidence to ourselves about who we are through our values. So by picking up the wallet, find the person, sending it to them and all that. And if it really doesn't matter to get credit from them, and if it really only matters to give yourself credit for you being honest, that's character. And clinically, that we might have all encountered this to a certain extent in some of our patients, that sense of emptiness, which is one of the criteria of borderline personality disorder. a sense of emptiness. So that, in my view, is the absence of character. And that doesn't necessarily mean that someone who feels empty in a moment is, doesn't have values. In my view, we all have values, but the only difference is to what extent do we identify with those values consciously and incorporate those values into our identity so that we reinforce our character. That, I think, is the difference. So kind of just going to glance over this, and the ultimate idea being that when our identity is based on outcomes. So for example, you just imagine the person whose identity is based on how much you like them based on their looks. And that person is gonna, perhaps get a bunch of, surgeries and all that. And but their physical appearance is externally threatened by time and age. That's not something that they can internally, that's not a core need that they can take care of internally. How much weight you can lift, or getting the championship or whatever, these are all externally threatened. And they're threatened in ways that are outside of your control. Someone else can take that away from you. And if your identity is based on these secondary outcomes, then your identity is unstable. That's instability in your identity. Versus when your stability comes from when your identity is based on your values, because your values can only be threatened internally by your own decisions. No one else can take that away from you. And when your identity truly is based on your character and your values, that is true stability, because they can only be threatened internally through your own decisions. And so with this whole discussion, you might think, our outcomes just totally bad. And so should we just do away with our outcomes and just be totally process oriented? So Buddhism might actually say that, might agree with that. And there's a core idea of non-attachment to results. And in this book by Dan Harris, a reporter who had this panic attack on live TV, writes this book and how he got into mindfulness and Buddhism, or really just mindfulness, and just got to a point where he really achieving this non-attachment to results, non-attachment to outcomes. And he realized what that looked like was an absence of motivation, actually. He was fully compassionate, really embodied gratitude and all that, but his coworker is telling him, dude, you're totally unmotivated now. What's changed in you? So is there a balance? And so this is one of my favorite graphs. If that makes me a nerd for having a favorite graph, then so be it. But this is a graph of sine x over x. And so as you see, this really describes any process of change or any process of development. And so again, this is not time. The x-axis is not time. It's actually just stages of development. You can be in that first stage for a long time and never get to the second stage or third stage perhaps. But first stage, for an example, and so each, the positive side and the negative side being two opposite sides of any dialectic, or any balance in terms of kind of just two opposites that are mutually exclusive. And so for example, we've all gone through a period of development where through our childhood, we're dependent. And so we're dependent on others. That would be that first stage. And then there's a second stage where perhaps we rebelled and we valued independence. Like, I don't need anyone, I can take care of myself and I don't need my parents or whatever. We've all gone through a version of that. And maybe another example being the first stage being idealization, where our parents are totally perfect. And then a second stage being like, oh my God, they're totally imperfect. And then a third stage being finding a balance between the two sides of the dialectic. And this isn't, and we find that it's more about being able to use one side, your bicep when you need to, and being able to use your tricep when you need to, versus being only able to use your bicep in situations where you need to use your tricep. That's going to cause problems. And if you only can use your tricep, being only able to use your, in situations where you need to use your bicep, that causes problems. So same thing with outcomes versus process. Through development, we are outcome oriented. And then there can be a second stage of perhaps being too process oriented. And then there's a balance, just like Dan Harris discovered. There's a balance between being outcome and process oriented, having that kind of thinking. And if you really dig into it, our outcomes are going to take care of themselves. You know, you're always going to have impulses and wants and needs and all of that. Those are going to take care of themselves, but you have to take care of the process and how to guide yourself along those outcomes. And so the point being, it's not that outcomes don't matter. It's not that outcomes don't matter. It's that they do matter. I'm just going to skip this. It's not that outcomes don't matter. They do matter. But outcomes should be the guide, not the focus. And when process is prioritized as the focus, the outcome takes care of itself. So that's all we have today. Just want to thank you for sticking around and kind of sharing in this moment together. And so if you have any questions or comments, I'm happy to stick around for that. But it is 12 o'clock, and so certainly feel free if you have other obligations, but I'll be sticking around.
Thanks so much, Dr. Wolfgang. That was an excellent talk, and that's a super cute picture of a baby, little girl.
Thank you.
This is Marino. I have a question. You mentioned that you realized that emotions are tied to outcomes, and that was a breakthrough in therapy for you. Can you elaborate on that a bit and how you use that in therapy?
Oh yeah, no, that's a great question. So hopefully by now we understand that techniques are only 15% of any outcome in therapy. But what really matters is therapeutic alliance and those core common factors, which is 30 to 40% of how a patient does. And so, with that said, I do have kind of a favorite technique or maneuver that I do apply, and my patients all are kind of used to this by now. But so, for example, a patient might be saying, like, I really, either saying this explicitly or implicitly, saying that, oh, I really want dad to like me. When I go meet him or whatever, when I talk to him, whatever, I really want him to like me. And so that's the secondary outcome, external, out of your control. And so I would say something like, to what extent do you have control over whether dad decides to like you? I'll almost invariably say, no, 0% or almost no control. Okay, well, how much control do you have over connection, over being able to offer yourself to be vulnerable and to connect with him? Again, process. Oh, and they'll say, oh, sometimes they'll say like 100% or most, almost 100%. Well, what is it like to have full control over connection, of being vulnerable? What is it like to have full control over that? And almost invariably, for whatever reason, 80% of the time they'll say, I feel empowered. Or actually, I feel calm. I feel confident. And well, what is it like to feel calm or confident, whatever, and kind of taking it from there. And so the idea being, if we just go back to, so if we go back to this, really, we're saying we're kind of, what we're trying to do is release the grip on the secondary outcome, whatever that is. In this case, I want dad to like me. And releasing the grip on that, and we're helping them realize that they have zero control over the secondary outcome. They have zero control over whether dad likes me or not. But I have full control over connecting with him and allowing them to experience that they feel calm when they have full control over connecting or being vulnerable, or really anything in that column of process. And when I bring attention to how much control do you have over connecting or being vulnerable, whatever, I'm not making that up. That's something I already know about them based on the first half of that session and what we've already discussed about that session, what we've discussed in the past, and what I already know about them. I'm not inferring that. We've already talked about that connection is important to you, or that kind of thing. So that maneuver that I personally use typically comes toward the end of a session, and then kind of expanding and elaborating on that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Thanks. And what other questions or comments do you guys have?
This is Dr. Koval. Thank you so much, Dr. Wolfgang.
Thank you.
I was really pleased to see that you tied in the finite versus infinite games idea to it, because that's one of my favorite talks that you've given, and I'm looking forward to reading some of your reading suggestions. But I love the way you tied it all together, process versus content. It's yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I love the pictures of Rose.
Me too. Appreciate it.
Hey, Dr. Wolfgang, it's Dr. Wolf. I'll throw out a point for discussion maybe. So you made a great argument for why it's beneficial to focus on process rather than outcome. But I know that within processes can be outcomes. Like, for example, if we have a process to develop a great resident or a great physician, then there'll be outcomes along the way, like, scoring X score on the PRIDE or so on. To what extent do you think that outcomes within the process should be emphasized or de-emphasized, or if you could comment on that?
No, that I think is a great point. And I actually took that slide out and they just cut it down within 60 minutes. So I actually had like 2 hours of material, but that's a great point, because within any process, so there's always outcomes within any process. There's also always process within any outcomes. And so certainly, and again, don't take my word for it, kind of explore that yourself too. But certainly it is important to focus on those outcome measures within the process. And as long as, but the point being, as long as the process is prioritized and that we're potentially making it explicit that, this outcome measure matters, your score, the grade or whatever, your evaluation does matter. But what really matters is A, B, and C, that, you're professional, that you really care about patients or whatever. And there are going to be outcome measures within that. But as long as we're communicating, outcomes matter, but what really matters is the process and whatever that ends up being in that situation, for sure.
Thank you. Yep.
Thank you for the great question. And
I think one of the reasons, one of the many reasons I like your talk on finite versus infinite games and process versus in this talk is, it really is about how do you stay in the game, right? It's at least for me, it has never been about necessarily winning the grand prize, but having fun along the way, and how do I get to keep playing? And I think listening to your talks over these last couple of years has made that kind of implicit motivation explicit, and has helped me kind of think through that in a more definitive way. So I greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, and I think I really appreciate that comment too, because what I know about you, and I think what we can also all agree in terms of what we know about you, Dr. Koval, is that growth is important, and not only your own personal growth, but growing, promoting the growth of those around you. And I'd imagine that was true for you, maybe even before that was ever made explicit in your own personal journey. And I think by making that explicit, and how you have made that explicit to the program, helps people align along that. And so I also want to extend some gratitude to you in terms of making that explicit, for sure.
Thank you, Dr. Wolfgang.
Yeah. All right, so with that said, thank you all for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day. And I really appreciate you taking the time to hang out with us today.
Great job, Aaron. Well done.
Thank you, Aaron. Good job, man.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron.